So in my last video, I showed you guys a bunch of Radium engineering parts, and today I'm going to be installing some of them. Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, I'm Aisha. I hope you enjoy the content and consider sticking around by hitting that subscribe button and the bell icon so you get notified when I post new videos. If you're already a subscriber, thank you so much. I really appreciate each and every one of you. So in my last video, I showed you guys a bunch of Radium engineering fuel parts, and today I'm going to be installing all the parts to do with the fuel rail, which includes the fuel rail, the fuel pulse damper, the fuel pressure regulator, and of course the fuel pressure gauge. So let's get right into it. This is Radium Engineering's B series fuel rail. The fuel rail is CNC machined from 6061 aluminum and anodized in black. It has 3 8AN ORB ports, allowing you the flexibility to add all of your fuel components. And with 3 of these large ports, you can choose where you want to place your components on the fuel rail, which I will show you a little later in this video. This fuel rail also has the mounting point for a stock style fuel pressure regulator. This is Radium Engineering's direct mount fuel pressure regulator. This fuel pressure regulator gets installed directly to the fuel rail using Radium Engineering's 8AN ORB swivel fitting. Because this fitting swivels, it can absorb vibrations from the engine and minimize the risk of cracking fittings, which I know some people are concerned about when mounting fuel pressure regulators directly to the fuel rail. This fuel pressure regulator can also be remotely mounted. The return fitting is a 90-degree swivel fitting, which makes it super convenient when installing lines. The fuel pressure regulator has 2 1/8 NPT ports that can be used for various gauges, and it includes 2 1/8 NPT plugs in case you choose not to use the ports. The fuel pressure regulator also includes 2 orifices, so you have the ability to use this fuel pressure regulator with a wide range of fuel pump flow rates. The pre-installed silver orifice is rated for up to 900 lph or liters per hour, and the gold colored orifice is rated for up to 1500 lph or liters per hour. This is Radium Engineering's fuel pulse damper. The purpose of a fuel pulse damper is to basically absorb the pulses within the fuel system. When injectors open and close, they create pulses in the fuel rail, which can sometimes cause erratic fuel pressure, which can then cause issues like erratic idle surge, stumbling, and erratic air-fuel ratios that are difficult to be fixed with tuning. There are multiple versions of the fuel pulse damper. This version gets directly mounted to the fuel rail, and there is also an inline version. The fuel pulse damper includes a vacuum hose and a Y fitting for insulation. This is Radium Engineering's fuel pressure gauge. The gauge reads from 0 to 100 psi or 0 to 6.9 bar. The gauge is filled with silicone to prevent the needle from vibrating. It's mounted using a 1/8 NPT fitting, which can be mounted in multiple locations, which I will show you a little later in this video. All of these parts that I just showed you are compatible with E85. Be sure to check out Radium Engineering's website to determine which version of these parts would fit with your setup. With Radium Engineering's fuel rail, you have the option of mounting the components in multiple places. So I could mount this fuel pulse damper here on the end of the fuel rail, or I could mount it here on the top of the fuel rail. Same goes with the fuel pressure regulator. I could mount it here on the end of the fuel rail, or I could mount it on the top of the fuel rail. And with the fuel gauge, I can mount it here using this 90-degree fitting, or I could actually install the gauge here on the side of the fuel pressure regulator. You really have the option to mix and match and put the parts exactly where you want them to be. So first order of business, remove all the old parts. Installing a fuel rail is actually not that difficult. There's literally 3 bolts that hold it onto the intake manifold. Other than that, you just have to disconnect all of the fuel lines, and that's about it. So let's go. First, I'm going to remove the return line from the fuel pressure regulator and then disconnect the feed line. Then I'm going to remove this vacuum line from the intake manifold. Then I'm going to be removing these 3 nuts that hold the fuel rail onto the intake manifold. Now I'm going to try to wiggle the fuel rail off of the injectors. I prefer to leave the injectors in the intake manifold since I'm just replacing the fuel rail. It makes it easier to just put the new fuel rail over the injectors while they're already in the intake manifold. So I left the injectors in the intake manifold. Sometimes when you are taking the fuel rail off, some of the injectors actually get stuck in the fuel rail and come out of the intake manifold. I prefer to try to get them to stay in the intake manifold simply because they are still connected to the plug, and the type of plugs that I have, they have these little pins and it's kind of difficult to get them off. But if they come out, you just pop them out of the fuel rail and stick them back in the intake manifold. Now to install the new Radium Engineering fuel rail. I'm going to line up the injectors into the holes on the fuel rail and also line up the fuel rail with the 3 studs on the intake manifold. Then I'm going to press down and wiggle until the injectors are seated all the way into the fuel rail. When the injectors are going into the fuel rail, you want to make sure that the injector O-rings are not being pinched or rolled off of the O-ring slots on the injectors. To prevent that from happening, you may have to use a little bit of lubricant. Now I'm going to put the 3 10mm nuts onto the studs and tighten. Now to install the fuel pressure regulator. So when you're installing this swivel fitting here, you have to install it to the fuel pressure regulator first because there is a hex key fitting here. So you have to tighten this on to the fuel pressure regulator before you install this end into the fuel rail. Otherwise, if you put this end in the fuel rail, you won't be able to tighten this. So I'm gonna tighten this on here first. I'm gonna go ahead and tighten this one for the 90-degree swivel as well. When you're installing this 90-degree, you don't have to worry about tightening this right away simply because it's exposed, as to this one is not exposed once you install it to the fuel rail. And now that this is tightened, as you can see, it still swivels. Once we put it on and we need to rotate it in any direction to install the lines, we have no problems there. This one also rotates once it's installed. All right, so now let's put this fuel pressure regulator into the fuel rail. In case you are wondering, yes, I have this adjustable wrench taped with electrical tape. I do have a wrench that is made for these types of fittings, but it's too big to go in this spot. So because I won't be using any of the ports in the fuel pressure regulator, I'm gonna go ahead and install these 2 block-offs. The block-offs come with thread sealant already on them, so there's no need to use Teflon or any sealant. Next, I'm gonna install the fuel pulse damper, and I've decided to put this one on the end of the fuel rail. And this just has a fitting there. It is not swiveled, so you just basically tighten it on. So now I'm gonna install the gauge. This is the 90-degree fitting that goes in the fuel rail. So I'm gonna be using thread sealant on these threads. I don't like using that Teflon tape. I prefer using the liquid sealant. So when you're using this stuff, you basically just put it on a small portion of the threads. You don't need a lot of it. I don't even put it all the way around. I usually just put it, actually the instructions say, put it 3/4 of a way around. So I usually just do that and leave that small section out, because once the threads start going in, it will actually apply it onto the other parts of the thread. Then I'm going to put the thread sealant on the back of the gauge and then install the gauge into the 90-degree fitting. Alright, so now to hook up the vacuum hose, we have a Y here, so we basically have to tie this port and this port into the intake manifold port. So I'm going to start off by putting this Y into the hose here and measure for length. So I'm just going to cut here. This one, swivel on the fuel pressure regulator. Come around this way with it, come to Y. Last piece there. That looks about good. Then what I like to do is take some mini zip ties and put them around the hose where they go on to each one of these ports to prevent it from sliding off. That's what the vacuum hoses look like. So as you guys know, I'm in the process of finishing this fuel system, so I'm not going to start it up today, which is pretty sad because I won't be able to show you guys exactly how to adjust the fuel pressure. But basically you just loosen this nut here, then you take a hex or Allen key and loosen or tighten this stud in here. Right here it shows you to raise the fuel pressure, you turn it this direction, and to lower the fuel pressure, you turn it in this direction. That is pretty cool that they actually put these markings on here. I don't think I've ever seen a fuel pressure regulator that has that on there. Once you have the fuel pressure where you want it, you basically just tighten this nut to lock it in place. One other thing that I wanted to show you guys, I'm going to be running 6AN PTFE like I mentioned in my other video, and this fitting is actually pretty cool. It is a 6AN on this side that goes to the hose, and this side is that 8AN ORB, which is the port here on the end of the fuel rail. You don't have to have an in-between fitting. This hose end goes straight onto the fuel rail, which means less connections and obviously less potential for leaks. So that's it. So I'm going to end the video here today. We got the fuel rail installed and the fuel pressure regulator and the fuel pulse damper and the fuel gauge. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I really hope that it was helpful to you guys. Stay tuned for the next videos where we will be installing more Radium engineering parts and hopefully finish up this whole new fuel system so I can start the car up. I'm so excited. I cannot wait. Then I will be on to have to tune. Make sure that you guys are subscribed and hit that bell icon so you get notified when I do post videos. And I will see you guys in the next one. Peace.